This is a reading of The Men We Honor by James Connolly, written in 1898, published in Workers' Republic, and then transcribed by the James Connolly Society in 1997, now hosted at the Marxist Internet Archive. It touches the topic of the legacy of Wolfe Tone and how it has been co-opted largely by people who would have opposed Wolfe Tone during the life of Wolfe Tone. Anyway, on with the text. Apostles of freedom are ever idolized when dead, but crucified when living. Universally true as this statement is, it applies with more than usual point to the revolutionary hero in whose memory the Irish people will, on Monday the 15th of August, lay the foundation stone of a great memorial. Accustomed as we are to accept without question the statements of platform oratory or political journalism as embodying the various truths of history, the real meaning and significance of the life and struggles of the high-soured organization of the United Irish Movement of 1798 is too often lost to the people of Ireland today. We think with pride and joy of Wolfe Tone and his struggle for Ireland, but when we think of his enemies, of those who thwarted him at every opportunity, who cease not to revile him while alive and pause not in their calumnies even when he had passed beyond the grave, we are too apt to forget that the most virulent and unforgiving of those enemies were not the emissaries of the British Crown, but the men from whose lips the cant of patriotism was never absent, the leaders in church and politics of the people whose emancipation Wolfe Tone had labored to secure and met death in the effort to forward. Yet it is a lesson we need to remember, fraught as it is with meaning, in the task before the Irish democracy today. There are few passages in the life of Tone more pregnant with interest to the attentive reader than that which chronicles the negotiations between himself and the great Whig party of which Grattan was such a shining light. The attempt of the Whig aristocracy to cajole and bribe the young and ardent Democrat into lending his intellect and powers to the service of their party, and the scornful refusal of the high-minded but penniless Tone to thus prostitute his genius in the cause of compromise and time-serving, points a moral the young men of Ireland might well lay to heart in deciding under which flag they will take their stand in the struggle to which we henceforth challenge friends and enemies. "I was a Democrat from the commencement," proudly declared our hero, and in the light of that announcement we at once perceive why the wealthy classes of Ireland, with scarce a dozen exceptions, ranged themselves against him, why Grattan, never by word or deed, testified the slightest sympathy with the United Irishmen, why Dan O'Connell took up arms to defend Dublin for the British government against his own countrymen and rebel co-religionists, why the Catholic aristocracy fought side by side with the Orange yeomanry, why the fiercest invectives of Lord Castlereagh or Beresford of the riding school were but faint echoes of the maledictions heaped upon the revolutionists by the aristocratic Catholic bishops, why, in short, Wolfe Tone and his comrades were overwhelmed by the treachery of their own countrymen more than by the force of the foreign enemy. He was crucified in life, now he is idolized in death, and the men who push forward most arrogantly to burn incense at the altar of his fame are drawn from the very class who, were he alive today, would fasten to repudiate him as a dangerous malcontent. False as they are to every one of the great principles to which our hero consecrated his life, they cannot hope to deceive the popular instinct, and their presence at the 98 commemorations will only bring into greater relief the depth to which they have sunk. Our Home Rule leaders will find that the glory of Wolfe Tone's memory will serve not to cover, but to accentuate the darkness of their shame. Wolfe Tone was abreast of the revolutionary thought of his day, as are the socialist republicans of our day. He saw clearly, as we see, that a dominion as long-rooted in any country as British dominion in Ireland can only be dislodged by a revolutionary impulse in line with the development of the entire epoch. Grasping this truth in all its fullness, he broke with the so-called practical men of the time, and wherever he could get a hearing he, by voice and pen, inculcated the republican principles of the French Revolution and counseled his countrymen to embark the national movement on the crest of that revolutionary wave. His Irish birth did not create his hatred of the British Constitution, but only intensified it. Like Mitchell, 50 years later, he held ideas on political and social order such as would have made him a rebel even if he had been an Englishman. In this fact lay his strength and the secret of his enthusiasm. We who hold his principles cherish his memory all the more on that account, believing as we do that any movement which would successfully grapple with the problem of national freedom must draw its inspiration not from the moldering records of a buried past, but from the glowing hopes of the living present, the vast possibilities of the mighty future. When the hour of the social revolution at length strikes, and the revolutionary lava now pent up in the socialist movement finally overflows and submerges the kings and classes who now rule and ruin the world, high up in the topmost niches of the temple, a liberated human race will erect to the heroes and martyrs who have watered the tree of liberty with the blood of their body and the sweat of their intellect, side by side with the Washingtons, Kosciuszkos, and Tells of other lands, a grateful Irish people will carve the name of our precursor, Theobald Wolfe Tone, the man whose virtues we can only honor by imitation, as the Socialist Republic will yet honor his principles by realization. And that's the end of the text. I've got to say there's a very similar phenomenon taking place nowadays as what he's describing as happening with Wolfe Tone. He's describing Wolfe Tone as being co-opted, really, or the legacy of Wolfe Tone being co-opted by the home rule, non-socialist, nationalist Irish upper classes who themselves would have fought against Wolfe Tone. And we see that today with people talking in the United States highly of Martin Luther King Jr., who was actually quite unpopular to many of these classes of people who now sort of treat him like he had some high ideals, right? You might even say the same thing about Albert Einstein, who was a socialist, but they totally hide that, and they obviously totally hide Martin Luther King Jr.'s economic ideas as well. You might even extend this to modern Russian, the modern Russian Federation treating early Soviet figures like Lenin, even Stalin, as like heroes of Russia. When the people who are in charge of the Russian Federation would have probably been part of the white movement and probably would have opposed the formation of the USSR, to the last man. Also, I didn't know that Dan O'Connell, who, to be fair, I know very little about. I didn't know that Dan O'Connell also fought against rebellious co-religionists in Ireland. But I have to say this whole text is sort of soured by James Connolly showing his large blind spot about North American history by treating Mitchell, that is John Mitchell, in a positive way, and by treating especially Washington in a positive way. For those who don't know, John Mitchell was a sort of patriotic Irishman who was exiled from Ireland and spent time in the United States. He also was a slave trade expansionist who believed that the transatlantic slave trade should be reopened after it had already closed decades earlier. This is a figure from the mid-1800s. And for those who aren't aware, as certainly James Connolly wasn't aware, George Washington was a slave-owning genocider of Native Americans. So I could fully understand and sympathize with any North American viewer, or especially a Black American, Native American, or even an African viewer who is much more aware of George Washington, who would read this and think, okay, James Connolly is sort of showing a big blind spot there because he was not like a hero of liberation. That is to say, George Washington was not a hero of liberation. Except for, liberating the North American bourgeoisie, all the while enslaving Africans and continuing to genocide Native Americans. So I don't hold him in very high regard. Anyway, that's all for my commentary. Hope you all have a good one, and do not forget ruthless criticism of all things.